Hello friends, welcome to the CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on basic sociology. So far we have conducted numerous lectures for you and all the lectures are uploaded for you on the YouTube. Friends, if we talk about this particular lecture, today we are going to talk on agrarian sociology. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Archana Prasad. Dr. Archana Prasad is Assistant Professor in Department of Sociology, Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. Dr. Prasad is a prolific professor. She always has best examples to give you so that it becomes easier for you to understand the various topics of sociology in detail. Friends, today also, if you have any query regarding the lecture, then you can call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. You are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture so that first you could understand today's topic in detail. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Archana Prasad, once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you for a lovely introduction. Welcome back to the series of lecture in sociology, and to continue with the series, I'll be today talking about agrarian sociology. Agrarian sociology as a discipline is very important and critical because we know that in India a large populations are still base their livelihood on agriculture. It is very important to understand that there has not been a detailed understanding of agrarian sociology within the discipline of sociology and such, because of the nature of the emergence of the discipline, in the sense that it was developing at the time of industrial revolution, industrialization, and therefore much of the focus was gave to industrial society, urban society, and in that context agrarian issues were understood in the form of an evolutionary or a comparative approach. Therefore, it is very important to actually understand what is agrarian society, what is agrarian studies, how we talk about the development of agrarian sociology with specific focus on India, to try to understand what are the agrarian questions and to bring about the changes that has happened in the agrarian relation due to the interference of market economy, and that brings us to a comprehensive understanding of agrarian sociology. To begin with, we see that in the early 19th century, the study of rural society and agrarian society was considered as interdisciplinary. There was no specific focus as such or a discipline called agrarian sociology, because much of the contribution were coming in from economists, historians, and other disciplines. Agrarian sociology was based on kind of a historical speculation, or most of the time to understand the evolutionary approach. That is how the societies were shifting from one kind of simple society with certain kind of a simple economy to complex society, and in that evolutionary perspective, the agrarian society or the rural society was always considered to be in a kind of a form of a lower evolution from where industrial or urban society would evolve. And from a structural perspective, we see that these studies were actually lacking factual information, because as I already said, it was based on speculation. It was kind of a comparison of one society with the other society, and therefore what was not found in urban society was said to be belonging to the agrarian society. Most of the studies of agrarian and rural was based on the study of village, with the whole idea that village was the part of agrarian society. And therefore, whole idea, if we look into the understanding of agrarian structure in India, we see that it emerges with the whole understanding of Indian villages as self-sufficient, isolated village community, and much of these theories were coming in from Western scholars who were trying to, in a way, picturize village in India in comparison to the societies in the Western, and what was not found in the what was found in the Western society and was not found in the Indian society was considered to be idealized as a structure of the rural India. And therefore, it is very important to first try to understand the types of societies that we can have around, and that is to talk about agrarian society, industrial society, tribal society, peasant society. And here it is very important, and I will see through the course of the lecture that it is important to differentiate between agrarian society, peasant society, and also to differentiate between agrarian social structure and village as such, because it is very important to differentiate each of them to have a more holistic attention to the agrarian relations. Agrarian, as we know, implies agriculture. Therefore, the understanding is that agrarian societies are societies which are dependent on agriculture as a mode of economy, or the economy is basically based on farming and agriculture. So, the mode of production in the agrarian society is based on cultivation, and this is different from the hunting and gathering society where there was no cultivation. So, the hunting and gathering society would actually depend on gathering and hunting animals and for their survival, whereas from the gathering society we emerged in an agricultural society in which people started taking recourse to domestication of animal, to farming and cultivation of crops. It is mentioned in large number of literature that the first agrarian society emerged in 5000 to 6000 in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then in the later in China and India. So, to that extent we see that agrarian society is not something which is very peculiar to Indian society, but it is to be found in more or less across the world. And therefore, it is important to understand agrarian, where the modes of production is agricultural, to a kind of a communal collective ownership of property, to industrial or the capitalist society where the means of production is based on capitalism, which is based on private ownership of means of production. So, when we try to understand the agrarian society, we try to figure out a few salient structures and features which will help us to understand agrarian society in relation to other kinds of society. So, the first feature of agrarian society is to be understood in terms of occupational structure. And occupational structure, I said that agrarian society, a society which is based on agriculture. So, it is associated with domestication of animals. Animals are used in the purpose of farming and cultivation, and therefore there is a large number of dependence on a huge amount of domesticated animals like cows, goats, buffaloes, etc. Once cultivation and farming started, associated occupations like weaving, potters, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, so all of this started emerging in the form of a economy which was suitable for the rural areas. The second feature is in terms of forms of land ownership. As we know that most of the time land has been romanticized with village studies and with agrarian, because agrarian society implies cultivation, and cultivation implies the importance of land. So, the ownership of land basically is the determining factor which determines the social relations in agrarian society. And in the agrarian society, most of the time there was a kind of an understanding that it was landlords and zamindars who were owners of land, and they were then cultivators, and then there were tenants, and then there were landless laborers. So, we have a whole kind of an understanding looking into the land relation that agrarian societies are not homogeneous society, and class inequality is an integral part of agrarian social societies. Then we try to understand division of labor. Here we see that since there was most of the time the cultivation was for domestic consumption and the market is not very significant, most of the division of labor was based on age and sex. When we talk about sexual division of labor, it is evidence that there is a public-private division, whereas in terms of age, there could be certain kind of occupation which could be considered as more hard, and that was to be done by a elderly population. There is only predominant modes of occupation in these society is agriculture and domestication of animals. So then we come to the village community system, and we will see in later on in the understanding of the whole emergence of agrarian studies that the concept of community became very significant. It was used by Robert Redfield to understand homogeneous society, which was considered to be more or less egalitarian, and community was compared and contrasted to association. So there was a kind of a comparative understanding that community belonged to rural areas and association which belong to urban areas. So the village community, the village as a self-sufficient society, village as a homogeneous society, was kind of articulated in terms of understanding agrarian society. Now we come to the whole understanding of agrarian studies. Agrarian studies is basically study of rural society, and it emerged an important field of sociological investigations because it was observed that agrarian society is something which is found in every almost all parts of this world, and it has certain specificity, and you need to understand agrarian social relations, social structure within in itself per se, and not always on an evolutionary or a comparative method, and therefore it became significant to understand agrarian relation in its own context. It basically emerged as in 1960s in various departments of sociology across in both Western and Eastern universities. But in the initial stage, we see that there was a dominance of economics because the focus was to understand the impact of capitalism. It is important to keep in mind that this discipline was emerging at a time when industrialization and capitalism was in its full swing, and therefore much of the understanding was from a classical political economic aspect, in which the impact of capitalism or the impact of the penetration of the market economy in the agricultural area became the dominant perspective to understand agrarian society, and therefore much of the understanding of agrarian land relation was coming in from Marxian scholars who were trying to understand the society and its structures in terms of again a shift from an egalitarian society to a kind of an unequal society. In the Indian context, in the second part of the lecture, we'll see that most of the studies in the rural society on rural agrarian society was based on a kind of an understanding that there is a shift from a caste to class, in the sense that caste was more in terms of a social relations and class was more in terms of economic relation associated with the land and means of productions. So the Marxist theory of primitive accumulation of capital and feudal mode of production became a standard analysis. So if we to recall back, there have been lectures on understanding Marxian concept, and that is to understand how there has been a shift from a communal means of ownership of property to private means of property, and because of this there is a shift from a feudal to a capitalist mode of production, which implies more relation based on land and landlessness or ownership of property. And this became significant in understanding the agrarian social structure because, as I already said in the beginning, that agrarian society, the land is the dominating regulator of social relations, and therefore Marxian perspective became very significant. In Indian context, we see that in the 1950s and 60s, much of the study of agrarian society was influenced by the British tradition, and the British tradition were focusing on the study of village life as homogeneous egalitarian society. The most of the studies we will go through in the 60s and 70s were trying to document the structure of villages in different parts of the Indian subcontinent in order to come out with an evolutionary and a comparative study of rural and urban India. From 60s onward, there was a shift from village study to caste, and therefore we see large number of sociologists in India influenced by the Western scholars came out with an understanding that to understand Indian society, three institutions becomes very important, and that is caste, family and village. The three institution would understanding of the three institution helps us to understand India as a society. Then what was happening in the West? In the West, the the peasant studies was emerging, and with the whole theory of Robert Redfield, he regarded the rural population as egalitarian, homogeneous, and representing community life. So the concept of community was taken by a large number of scholars, and we had literatures and titles of book as Village Community, Village Community Life of Village in India. So community symbolically implied that it was a study of an egalitarian, homogeneous societies. 1970s onward, we see that agrarian studies became very dominant because with the understanding of social structures and relations to land, and therefore there was a demise of village study specifically. Again, towards the 1990s, the agrarian studies became a little diminished because of the understanding of trying to understand more in terms of impact of modern economy, capitalism, understanding the emergence of the neoliberal economy on agriculture as such, and therefore we have the emergence of sociology of agriculture as a discipline, focusing more in terms of the impact of the various economic transformation on agricultural life in India and in other parts. So we see that when we try to understand agrarian society or in terms of the village, it's a kind of based on a certain kind of assumption, and this assumption was that village in India was the social unit of analysis, and once you understand the village, its cultural social mode, it would help us to understand the economic understanding. However, there are a large number of thinkers who are of opinion that agrarian studies are different from village study, and therefore it is not necessary that village studies or agrarian studies should be considered as synonymous. What are the areas in which village study is different from agrarian studies? Number one is the period of studies. We see that village study was dominant in the 1950s and 60s, whereas agrarian studies came into dominance from 70s towards the 90s. Then the focus of study. In village study, the focus is on social, cultural and moral life of the inhabitant of rural areas, whereas in agrarian study, the focus is primarily on land and land relations and how the process of economic social changes are impacting the land relations, and therefore it is not necessarily to be assumed to be holistic of village study. The third difference between village study and agrarian study is in terms of method of study. Village study was basically done from a structural functional perspective and use of field work. So most of the time it was participant observation, going into the village, having spending life with the villagers and coming up with an ethnography of the social cultural life of the people, whereas most of the agrarian studies, as I have already said, were using the Marxian historical framework, which was basically trying to understand the changes and shifts in continuity happening in land and land relations. So therefore, it is important to understand the distinction between village studies and agrarian studies. When in the Indian context, we see that much of the studies were neither very close to village study nor agrarian studies. Andre Bette, for instance, says his studies fall somewhere between functionalist tradition of peasant studies and the political economic tradition. So he utilizes both the structural functional as well as the Marxian political economic perspective to understand agrarian changes taking place in Indian society. He studied the agrarian system concerned with problem of land and utilization of productive process. He refers to two significant aspects for understanding agrarian system, and first is the technological arrangement, that is the technology, science and other details which are used in the sphere of agriculture and cultivation, and the second is social organization, that is what the network of relations between people and how that determines the relation between land and other means of productions. So he is actually trying to combine the structural functional perspective as well as the political economic perspective in order to understand the material culture of the village in India. The study of agrarian system necessitates to understand land uses. So, as I already said, that agrarian studies, the primary focus is on land, and therefore it is very important to understand land uses, how people are related to the land, who was the ownership of land, who were benefiting from the product of the land, and that help us then to understand the relation between the different classes in the agrarian society. When we also try to understand the distinction between peasant studies and agrarian studies. In the Western society, the whole understanding of peasant society became very significant. However, the term peasant was used ambiguously and was with different authors were using it in different meaning. In one context, it is used for agricultural who are homogeneous and small holdings operated mainly by family labor. The second meaning of peasant is that it includes all those who depend on land, including the cultivators as well as the managerial supervisors and such. When we look into the contemporary Indian society, we cannot use the concept of peasant to understand the agrarian structure, because they are no longer dependent on the same master. The landlord and the landless relation, the tillers relations have undergone transformation, and it is the agrarian social structure is not as it was in the pre-colonial or the colonial period. According to Andhra Bethe, agrarian study is different from study of peasantry. Peasantry refers to more or less homogeneous and undifferentiated community. It is egalitarian. There is no difference between, there is no class relations between, and therefore all are, because it's a family land holding and all production is for consumption of the society, and therefore there is no concept of class relations coming in. The gradient system is conceived by social scientists, refers to land and its utilization and to the productive process, and therefore we cannot actually try to understand the concept of peasant to understand agrarian relations in society. From the 1990 onwards, the concept farmer has been used in place of the peasant, because farmer indicates more in terms of those who have a direct relation to land and its product. Then we try to understand some of the approaches which has been used in agrarian studies, and that is first is the evolutionary approach. As I already said, in the initial 19th century, the evolutionary and comparative method were two ways in which society was being understood. Baden-Powell and Sumner main approach, they interested in the study of original nature of rights on land in India, focused on who exercised control over land and cultivated the land, the pattern of distribution, the evolution of community ownership of land into individual ownership. So, there is a transfer from the communal ownership of land to private means of ownership, and this was because of the coming in of the market economy, which led to the kind of individual having a hold over the land and its product in order to have a larger share in the profit. So, with a change in the economic structure, there was a change in the social relation among individuals, and therefore it also, the emergence of the private means of property also led to the emergence of the landlords and the class situation in agrarian relation. The evolutionary approach make reference to the Britishers, who were considered as bringing in about introducing capitalist mode of production in the Indian context. Prior to the Britishers, agrarian social structure in India was more or less feudal and semi-feudal. Then we try to see that these limitations of these studies, and these studies are limited in the sense that there is kind of historical speculation and there is too much of dependence on comparative method. We also have the approach of Irfan Habib, who tried to understand the evolutionary understanding of agrarian structure during the Mughal period, and he was trying to understand the emergence of communal rights in land. He suggested that the village community was a name for the corporate body formed by villagers for the collective action other than production organization. So, village was not only in terms of the economic relation, it was more in terms of community and social life. He used a Marxian analysis to understand the changes that happen in the agrarian relation due to the impact of British rule. Then we have A.R. Desai's approach, who used an historical materialistic approach to understand social transformation in India. According to Desai, the structure of deprivation has been affected by structures of agrarian system, and most of these scholars were trying to understand that the agrarian structures in Indian society was subject to change because of the British rule, which brought about the land revenue system and which brought in the market to interfere with the community life of the people, and this led to commercialization of agriculture, leading to exploitation and to the emergence of a class structure in the society. He also has written specifically on the peasant struggle and does a comparative study of this peasant struggle in the pre-independent and post-independent period. We also have P.C. Joshi's approach, who was trying to understand again the changes that happen in the agrarian social relation because of the land reforms and land revenue system which has taken place. And he also points out to the increase in the gap between between agricultural growth and egalitarian distribution of resources. And P.C. Joshi points out to the failure of government programs and policy in bringing about an egalitarian land relations. So much of the policies and reforms which were initiated by the governments in terms of abolition of Jamindar, I'll look into it in the next part, but we just try to understand P.C. Joshi's approach, and he was saying that these programs and policies have failed to a large extent. There was a large number of studies which emerged in the post-independent period, but what is significant is to keep in mind that all these studies were basically trying to understand the shifts and continuities taking place in the agrarian social relation because of the impact of industrialization, globalization and capitalism. And to a large extent, it will be understood by towards the end of the lecture that there has been a negative nature of the way in which agrarian relations and there is a kind of a agrarian crisis in the Indian context. With this I come to an end to the first half of the lecture, and that's just to try to understand. In the first half, I am trying to focus on trying to understand emergence of agrarian studies, but always keep in the context reference to India, because it helps us to understand things more clearly. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on agrarian sociology, and for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Archana Prasad. Dr. Archana Prasad is Assistant Professor in Department of Sociology, Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Archana Prasad on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Friends, now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Prasad, once again, and would request her to continue further.
Thank you, Gitika. Welcome back to the second half of the lecture on agrarian sociology. In the second half, I'll be basically talking about the class agrarian structure, agrarian class relations, land reforms, changes in the land reform, and post-independent scenario of the agricultural agrarian society. And here, again, as I have already said, I keep in the Indian context for explanation and illustration, because it helps us to understand the society more clearly, as we more or less are familiar with the society. To start with, I'll talk about the agrarian structure. Structure, as we know, implies networks of relation. In the agrarian structure, refers to how the people are associated or related to land and its distribution. So basically, it is in terms of who owns the land, who has the right to have the larger profit from the cultivation, who cultivates the land, how much of the product of cultivation is given to the cultivator, what is the mode of payment, is it cash, is it kind, what are the changes that have happened in the ownership of land, cultivation, because of change in the political economic structure. So basically, these are some of the concepts which will help us to understand agrarian social structure. To keep in mind, the agrarian social structure has not been constant or has not been the same. It has undergone a large amount of change, from feudal to semi-feudal to currently a capitalist mode of kind of understanding, where there is too much of commercialization and capitalist input to increase the agricultural output. When we try to understand agrarian social structure, it is important to understand the two institutions, that is caste and class. And as we know, caste is in terms of the ranking into the fourfold division of society, when class, to go by a Marxian understanding, is the economic relation, is this economic position in the society. So in the earlier studies, most of the scholars would take an evolutionary understanding and say that caste and class are two ends of the continuum, and there is a shift from caste-like relation to a class-like relation in the rural agrarian society. But later on, there comes on to the whole understanding that both caste and class are coexisting in the rural society, and there is a kind of a nexus. In the sense that both caste and class operates in a manner as such that the privileged position or the higher position is accumulated by those who are the owners of land and means of production, and therefore the agrarian social relation becomes exploitative. So it is important to understand the social structure in terms of the caste-class nexus, because it also helps us to understand the interplay with politics and where it leads to a large amount of agrarian conflict because of the caste-class nexus. In agrarian society, as has been understood in the first half of the lecture, land is the most important resource, and all social relations circulate around land relation. It is with reference to the ownership and possession in the land that leads to the emergence of a class society. So caste structure, the whole understanding that in the earlier period or in the 19th century or the pre-colonial period, it was more of a caste structure, and the present 21st century is more of a class, is not a correct way to understand agrarian caste structure. And we need to understand or try to understand, there has been a large amount of studies which are trying to understand how both caste and class are functioning together in order to create a kind of a divided society with the emergence of two categories of people, those who have huge control over resources and power, and the other lot who are landless and who are impoverished. So when we try to understand the agrarian class relations, we try to understand it in terms of the ownership of land, and as we know, in terms of the whole idea of the relation between land and not only economic wealth but also to power. So those who have ownership of land are the ones who are economically well off, and are also those who are politically well off, and therefore they are the class which are in terms of the understanding on the upper spectrum. It is these set of relations among the owners of land and those who provide various forms of services to landowning group that we call agrarian class structure. The British policies created new foundation for the emergence of feudal agrarian class structure. So we see the class structure during the British period, because of the policies which introduced by them, could be classified into the jamindars. These jamindars were non-cultivating owners of the land, and they were the ones who were tax gatherers. Then the second were tenants, who were the real cultivators, but they had no security of land tenure. And the third category was the agricultural labor, who were working on this land but were like bonded labor, so they could only get a part of the product either in cash or in kind. The land agrarian relations or the exploitative policies of the Britishers were also in the agenda of the nationalist struggle, and therefore there was a demand for removal of the jamindari and landlord system, which led to a kind of demise of the feudal class structure in the Indian society. And the leaders of the freedom struggle and nationalist movement were made it integral to understand the whole idea of egalitarian class relation as integral to the shaping of modern India. When we try to understand the theorization of class relation, we see Daniel Thorner's contribution becomes very significant. He is one of the earlier sociologists to have come out with a classification of the class system in the agrarian context, and his classification had been used and utilized by a large number of scholars and thinkers to understand agrarian class relations. So he divided the agrarian population on taking on the basis of three criteria. Number one was type of income earned from land in terms of rent or fruits of cultivations or wages. The second criteria was nature of rights held in the land, such as proprietary or tenancy or sharecropping rights or no rights at all. The third was extent of field work actually performed, such as absentees. So we also have absentees landlords who had ownership over landlord but were not present in the vicinity of the land, and they had no relation with the land as such. And those landlords who were present and would partially be involved in cultivation and other agricultural production. The third kind of work in the land were those landlords who would be completely involved in the land in terms of family labor. And then the fourth category is in terms of tillers, or those who were landless laborers who were working on the lands of others. On the basis of these three criteria, he suggested the following three categories of class in agrarian India. The first is Malik. The Malik is the income derived primarily from property rights in the soil, and whose common interest is to keep the level of rents up, keeping the wage level down. So as the term exists, they are the ones who have ownership over land, but they are not doing any kind of labor on the and these labor are done by the landless workers, laborers, and it is the Malik who would determine how much of product would be given to the laborers. So they will also get work done, and they also collect rent from tenants and subtenants and sharecroppers. The second category is Kisan, as the Kisan is also termed used for farmers, and earlier it was also used for peasants, and they are basically the cultivators who have taken lands from the Maliks and who are cultivating them. with their own labor and with the help of the family members. So they don't have ownership of land, but they pay rent for the land. The third category is mazdoor, and mazdoor means workers, the landless laborers. They have no ownership of land, and they have they don't even have share in the land. They cannot take land on rent, and therefore they provide their labor in cultivation, and in return they were paid either part of the product or paid wage. Thorner's classification of agrarian problem was not very popular among the students of agrarian change in India, because of the emergence of the capitalist relation in the economy, and that has led to a change in the older agrarian class relation because of the importance of market and because of the interaction with the global economy. In most regions of India, the Malik have turned into enterprising farmers. So now the Malik, because of their economic high status, were able to use Western knowledge, Western technology, and therefore they became more in terms of capitalist farmers. The class structure in rural area has also been affected because of the various land settlement policy and the land reform policy which was introduced in post-independent India. When we look into the class structure in post-independent India, we see that there has been a general classification done to understand agrarian class relation, and this is based on the following category. The first is big farmers and landlords, and they have ownership over 10 hectares of land, so they have ownership over huge amount of land. The second is small farmers and landholders with 2 to 10 hectares of land. Then we have marginal landlords with less than 2 hectares of land, and then we have agricultural laborers or the landless laborers. R.K. Mukherjee has referred to 3 classes in agrarian structure: landholders, supervisory farmers, self-sufficient peasantry, sharecropper and agricultural labor. Depending on the criteria of ownership, the relation to the land, and in kind of a work done to a large number of scholars have provided the different modes of classification, but what common that run across them is in terms of a category of people who belongs to the upper hierarchy. They are the ones who own land. Then we have the middle who have some amount of land, they do some amount of work, and the third category are those who own no land and are always working on the fields of others. When we have Yogendra Singh has referred to several change in the agrarian class structure after independence, and that is in terms of the introduction of government policies, change in the land revenue system, abolition of jamindari, introduction of capitalist mode of production. A number of significant changes can be seen in the agrarian class relation. The number one is that there is a wide gap between land reform ideology and the actual measures that were introduced. As I already said, that the bringing about an egalitarian land relation was an ideal among most of the nationalist struggle, and with that ideology a large number of measures were introduced in the post-independent policies and programs. But when it comes to implementation, most of the implementation failed, and therefore a wide range, a wide gap exists between actual implementation and the theoretical understanding of egalitarian land relation. The second is that the gap is the result of the class character of politicians and administrative elite, and there is a kind of a nexus that operates, that in most of the time it is the upper elite who are the politician and administrative who also are somehow from upper class, who are not very interested in implementing the policy which would benefit the lower laborers. The third is economic prosperity of the rich peasantry has increased, but the economic condition of the small peasant has deteriorated. So the gap between the landlords or the richer farmers and the landless has widened in the post-independent India. The feudalistic type of tenancy has been replaced by capitalist type of lease labor or wage labor in the agrarian system. So the exploitation has not changed. The modes of payment has increased. The type of way in which the landlords or the peasants deal with landless laborers is again based on a kind of higher superiority and inferiority relations. Inequalities between the top and the bottom level of have increased rather than decreased. Agricultural workers not receive the benefits of land reform. So much of the changes that happened in the land reform again benefited the upper class who were actually owners of land. So those who were the landless laborers did not benefit from the land reform policy. The sociological process dominant in the current class transformation in the village involves embossment of some and pluralization of many strata. So therefore, the policy in itself, or the way in which land reform policies and other programs of the government were implemented, it actually led to the increase in the number of proletariats or those who were the landless laborers. The numbers expanded, and whereas those who actually were benefited from it were less in number, and therefore they were able to improve their class status. CEC-UGC, referring to the trend in agrarian class structure, has observed that there is a decline in feudalistic types of tenancy and its replacement by more exploitative lease arrangement. The rise of commercially oriented landlord. Then the other thinker that talks about change in class relation is Andre Bethe. He refers to change from cumulative to dispersed inequalities due to changing social stratification. So earlier it was a larger group that would benefit from the agrarian social structure, whereas now the benefits is being dispersed, and therefore it's a small population that actually benefits from any kind of change. Then we try to understand the land revenue system during the British period. We are familiar with that there were three kinds of land revenue system which was existing during the British period. The first was the permanent settlement or the Jamindari system, and this was introduced in Bengal, Orissa, Bihar and district of Banaras by Lord Cornwallis in 1793. In this, the Jamindars were recognized as the owners of the land. The amount of revenue that the Jamindar had to pay was fixed, and it was decided that it won't be raised for the given period of time. Then we had Ryotwari system. It was introduced in Bombay, Madras, Assam and Bengal. It was introduced by Thomas Munro, and it was during the lordship of Lord Hastings. There was no Jamindar in South India. The company recognized the peasant as proprietor. Under the Ryotwari system, a direct settlement was made between the government and the Ryot and the cultivator. The third system is the Mahalwari system, which was introduced in 1833 by William Bentinck. It was modified form of the Jamindari settlement, permanent settlement, and under this system, basic unit of revenue settlement was mahal or village. The village land belonged jointly to the village community. They were responsible for payment of the revenue. Entire land of mahal was measured at the time of fixing revenue. They were also known as Bhaichara or mahals, which was basically group of villages. By looking into the three system of land revenue, it is evident that there is a kind of profit making motive by which the only focus of the British or the colonial rulers was to extract the maximum from the lands of and in the terms of extracting the maximum profit, it led to a kind of penetration of the profit making motive among the landlords and jamindar, and this was the root of or the beginning of exploitative class relation in Indian society. And that is why large number of scholars have attributed the British or the colonial rule for the introduction of inequality or relation, class based relation in agricultural agrarian societies in India. We see the impact of land revenue system. These land settlements were introduced a market economy and removed customary rights. With cash payment of revenue, there was increased money lending activity. The land tenure system sharpened social differentiation. While rich had access to courts to defend their properties, the poor did not have any resources. The peasants were forced to grow commercial crops, which led them to buy food grains at higher prices and sell the cash crops at low price. The land revenue system of British in India shook the stability of Indian villages, where majority of dependent agricultural related activities. They became miserable if crop failed in any given year. In overall, to say that it was the beginning of the exploitative relation in the society, with commercialization, with introduction of market economy, and with capitalist motives of profit making. The inequality of class based relation was introduced in the Indian agrarian society. Land reform implies existence of defect, that something is deformed or malformed that does not suit existing conditions. So we know that because of the movement or part of the nationalist movement that highlighted the inegalitarian exploitative conditions of peasants and landless laborers, it was initiated, or it was considered important to bring about a land reform in the Indian context, and that was to do away with the defects or malfunctioning of the system. It tries to remove about the malfunctioning or defects which is with reference to the rights in land. It has been defined as integrated set of measures designed to eliminate obstacles to economic and social development. Land reform does have transformation of agrarian structure and are also called structural reforms. Land reform is often used interchangeably with agrarian reform, but in actuality they are not the same. Agrarian reform is considered to have a wider meaning than land reform, entailing not only a wide redistribution of land but also provision of infrastructure services and sometimes a whole program of redistributive and democratic reforms. So land reform is narrow redistribution which will benefit a group of beneficiary. Basically, to say land reform would bring about a change in the ownership of land, in the way in which the individuals are given right over land or denied rights over land, whereas agrarian reform is more holistic in the sense it would talk about not only bringing about change in the relation to land, but also in terms of other aspects, social, cultural and a technological aspect related to the agrarian social structure. Then we look into agrarian reform after independence. We see as there has been an abolition of jamindari system, there has been collective farming introduced, land holdings have been consolidated, cooperative movements have been started in Indian agricultural system. In the jamindari system has been abolished. Land reform was introduced in the first 5-year plan. Then we also have the Green Revolution, which was introduced in the 1960s and 70s, which was in terms of the introduction of higher technology and hybrid seeds, fertilizers to improve agricultural product. And for an initial period, it did lead to an increase in agricultural production, but after a period of time, its negative effects or consequences were clear. Then we also have, when we try to understand agrarian social structure, we need to also understand agrarian movements, or in terms of the struggles that the agrarian society has undergone. And we see that agrarian movements implies agrarian classes which are related to agriculture in terms of working of land or in terms of working on land and its ownership. Agrarian classes have not always remained silent observer, they have reacted to the exploitative conditions, and as we know, James Scott has said that there is a kind of evidence of everyday form of resistance, in the sense in everyday activity or in everyday relation between the landlord and jamindar, a certain kind of resistance could be seen, and it's also part of an organized resistance which is in forms of peasant struggle or agrarian movement. And there have been agrarian movements in India in the pre-independent period as well as in the post-independent period, but there has been a difference in the nature of the revolt or the cause of its revolt. A large number of approaches has been used to understand agrarian movements. Here I will just broadly look into the three. That is the Marxian approach, which analyzes movements in the light of social relation of production or economic relations, how poorer class gets mobilized against the exploitation of the richer or the capitalist class. Then we also have a non-Marxian emphasis, the non-Marxian, they emphasize the non-economic aspect, or they would emphasize the cultural aspect into consideration. They will look into aspects like caste, geographical location, size of land holding, etc. Then we have the third approach to understand agrarian movement is subaltern school. The subaltern school would argue that the peasants have their own consciousness. So and the subaltern is basically an approach from the below. So they'll try to understand the movement in terms of the perspective of the agricultural farmers and peasants themselves. Then we look into a kind of understanding of how agrarian movements have been understood in Indian context. We see that most of the study of agrarian movements or agrarian struggle in India began in the 1970s. And Barrington said that revolutionary potential of the Indian peasantry. He was saying that the Indian peasants were more or less docile and passive. They were not agitated, or they would not actually react to the exploitative conditions. However, his approach, Moore's approach of considering Indian agricultural class as passive and docile, has been questioned by Kathleen Gore, A.R. Desai and D.N. Dhanagre. All these authors have maintained that agrarian society has never been silent, or have never been resisting, have always resisted the exploitative, and therefore since the 19th century to the current present times, there has been innumerable numbers of protest and struggle by the peasant community. So Dhanagre's contribution to peasant movement actually challenged Western theorization and helped us to understand peasant movement in the new context. He was greatly concerned with the devastating social consequences of the ongoing ruthless global transition and impact especially on rural and agrarian society. With great disenchantment, he observed how neoliberalism divided the popular movement and demobilized the forces of resistance. If we do a comparative understanding of the agrarian movement in the colonial period and the post-independent period, we see that there is a difference in the nature. In the British period, the struggles between jamindars, tenant and subtenants, whereas in the and therefore it is referred as anti-colonial movement. Whereas in the post-independent period, it is abolition of jamindari system has changed, and therefore the state has become the target of. Unlike the jamindars and colonial in the British period, the struggle is against the state, which has failed in its programs and policies. And when we look into in terms of alliance, the peasant struggle in the colonial period was part of the nationalist struggle for independence, whereas now most of the struggle is in terms of dominant and class conflicts. The dominant organization in the British period were the Kisan Sabha. Nowadays we have a large amount of organizations which are talking about. We also have the new farmers movement in India, which is basically started in the 1970s, and it is in Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Karnataka, Maharashtra. So there is a kind of the understanding that neoliberal economy, globalization, capitalism has actually divided India into two halves, into Bharat and India, which a large number of politician leaders have said Bharat is the rural part and India is the urban part. And this only hints at the widening of the economic gap between those who have capitalist means and those who don't have. So with this, I try to come to an understanding that the agrarian structure is needs to be understood, because there is a large amount of transformation and agrarian questions that needs to be addressed to understand Indian society. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, for queries, do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.